Jeremy Richman is the founder and CEO of the Avielle Foundation, a nonprofit research and education organization that seeks to understand the underpinnings of violence and aggressive behavior so that it can be prevented. Jeremy has over 15 years of research experience, primarily in neuroscience and pharmacology. Here today to tell us about the unique approach the Avielle Foundation is taking to understand and preventing violence, here's Jeremy.
Can everybody hear me okay in the back there? All right, I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you guys today. The title of my talk is The Science of Violence, Preventing Violence Through Research and Education. And I think I just want to start off with a very simple concept that it's only through understanding that we can change things. It's only through understanding that we can decrease barriers of fear, stigma, trepidation, and that's what I want to talk about on in the most important sense of the talk today. So I appreciate your being here, and I hope I convey that. The other thing I'd like to get across is it's a big room, but please feel free to raise your hand or just interrupt me at any time if something's not clear or you'd like me to go into more detail on something. By all means, interrupt, and since nobody ever does, at the end of my talk, I'd be glad to take questions also. I'd like to start by introducing myself, and I'd like to introduce myself in two ways. First, well, let me tell you about my talk first. The talk is going to be a brief introduction. I'm going to talk about violence itself and what are the faces of violence, what forms does it take. I'm going to describe some stats and facts for you just to illustrate how prevalent violence is and how we react to violence. I'm going to introduce the concept of you can imagine. Then I'm going to introduce the Avielle Foundation to you, describe a paradigm of violence and how violence, what are some of the risk factors for violence, the concept of neuroplasticity and the need for innovation and how we can approach the problem of violence that we have, particularly in the U.S. The brain itself is just another organ. I think that we've really put it up, sort of separate from other organs, but it is just another organ. Like the heart, like the lungs, the liver, the kidneys, we can study it just like any other organ. But unlike the other organs, it's very, very complex. And it has a lot of non-obvious features. First of all, it's hidden in our skull. It's not WYSIWYG. It's not what you see is what you get. You can't just point to something and say, well, that's muscle, it must do something with the muscle. You look at it and you don't get a lot of structure function from it. In addition, because of the nature of the brain being critical to all body functions, you can't take it out and put it back and be okay. So as a result, just like any other organ, it can be studied. However, there's a lot more pieces of the puzzle missing from the brain than there are from other organs. So now let me introduce myself. I'm Jeremy Richman. I have a PhD in neuropsychopharmacology. I got interested in science, I think as you guys will probably all experience or already have experienced, when something touches you personally, you become involved. You grab onto it, and that's what gets you interested in things. My interest in science started when I had a grandfather that had really bad Alzheimer's disease, and it amazed me at how debilitating it was and how it really changed a personality and really affected my grandfather's life and in our life. And that got me into neuroscience to understand what could go wrong in the brain that could change the behavior. So in Arizona, in Tucson, I started studying neuroscience. I started working in labs and doing research into underpinnings of Alzheimer's disease. And eventually I earned my interest really took flight, and I earned a PhD in pharmacology. And pharmacology is the study of how any chemical, whether it's what we make in our own bodies, or whether we take it in our food and nutrition, or whether we take some kind of therapeutic intervention, a drug of some sort. It's the study of how those affect the body, and I was particularly interested in how those chemicals affect the brain. And I took this experience to postgraduate work at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, studying neuroscience again. And I worked there for some years, and then I took an opportunity to begin working in the drug discovery arena at a company in San Diego, California called Arena Pharmaceuticals, where I was studying therapeutics to treat Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and schizophrenia. My interests then expanded a little bit to cardiovascular metabolic diseases, looking at atherosclerosis, clogging of the arteries, thrombosis, diabetes, and obesity. And based on the varied experience I had, I was recruited out here to Connecticut to work at another drug discovery company, Boehringer Ingelheim, that's over in Danbury, Connecticut, Richfield. My wife as well, she's a scientist also, and a big advantage that we can speak the same language, but a huge advantage that we don't both study neuroscience. She's an immunologist, and she got a degree in pathobiology, went with me to Vanderbilt, where she expanded into pharmacology. She then went into oncology, and she's now a medical writer studying cancer. So that's Jennifer and I as scientists. Now, unfortunately, I come to talk to you guys today to introduce myself in another way as parents that lost our only daughter, our 6-year-old Avielle, when she was murdered along with 19 of her classmates and friends and 6 of her educators on December 14th of 2012 in the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. And so, as you can imagine, you were all touched by that event, probably very personally, and you can imagine that we were touched by it very closely. So this brings me to why I'm here today to talk about violence and what I think we can do about preventing violence. So let's start the talk out by introducing violence itself. What is it? And violence is the intentional use of force, threatened or actual, against a person or a group of people or a community at large that has a likelihood of injury, death, psychological harm, or maldevelopment. This is the definition as proposed by the World Health Organization. And it takes on a number of different faces, but I think a lot of people are over here in the community-directed violence area. Everybody pictures this externalized violence, but we forget that violence is more often, self-directed. Self-directed violence includes engaging in unhealthy behaviors, addictions, self-cutting, all kinds of neuroses that are damaging to the self. And the ultimate self-directed violence can clearly be suicide. But in the more traditional sense, community-directed violence can take on forms directed against the family or a partner or the social peer group outside of the family, against a child, a partner, or a parent or elder in the family, and clearly against a stranger or acquaintance in the environment. And what are the faces that violence can take? Violence can take basically 4 forms: sexual, physical, psychological, or that of deprivation and neglect. And I think, again, highlighting things that are not traditional, I don't think people typically recognize that deprivation and neglect is a form of violence, but it can be very extreme, particularly children. When they're neglected, that is a very serious form of violence. We can also think on the other end of the spectrum, prisoners of war or incarcerated inmates that undergo neglect. That is very damaging to the brain. Another point that I'd like to make before I go on is that as far as trends go, so there's always exceptions to every rule. For the most part, violence takes a sexually dimorphic form. Males explode and act out violently in a community-directed fashion, and females implode and generally manifest their violence in a self-directed fashion. Another point that I'd like to make is that while we can bucket the forms of violence as the sexual, physical, psychological, or deprivation, neglect, clearly acts of violence blur those boundaries. We have things like domestic abuse that can take sexual, physical, psychological, and neglectful forms. I always like to point out to younger children and to high school age children that bullying can take on all forms of these buckets of violence, and hate crimes can span the whole range and be incredibly damaging. So how do we look? How's violence look in the United States? Based on the FBI Uniform Crime Report in 2012, it looks pretty good. The estimated number of offenses from 2008 to 2011-12 has dramatically decreased. But I'm sure a lot of you are probably squinting at this and saying, well, where's the y-axis? And when we put the numbers there, the estimated number of violent offenses has decreased only from 1.4 million to 1.2 million. And that's countless victims, if you think about it, that are affected by this. And if you more appropriately graph it, the goal being no violent offenses, you can see that this is probably just fluctuation over time. And only time will tell if that's real. It's not a wide enough window to recognize if there's a real trend there. But the fact is, one violent crime occurs every 26 seconds. The time that we're sitting in this room, there will be 2 murders in the United States, maybe more. 1 robbery every 90 seconds, 1 assault every 42 seconds. And if you look around, I don't know, I'm estimating there's maybe 50 people in here. 20% of us, so 10 of you will be victimized by violence this year. Another scary statistic is that the US soldier is more likely to die by suicide and 50 times more likely to be sexually assaulted or raped than to die in combat. I think that's entirely unacceptable. But here's the point, and I think that this is very important for us to focus on, is that we spend a lot more money and time, around 8,200 times more in a monetary sense, to contain and react to violence than we do to understanding and preventing violence. And this is going to be very damaging because we're always going to be able to react to it. It will never change anything unless we try to prevent it. If you put this in another a graphical sense, I'm a picture kind of person. 37% of the federal spending is on containment. That doesn't seem very proportionately valuable or useful. Another way to look at this in terms of reaction versus prevention, here's an aerial view of Sandy Hook, where I live. And down here is Fairfield Hills Mental Health Hospital. It's right near. I go running around there most evenings. And it's a scene for a lot of movies now because it's a lot of big, scary old brick Gothic-style buildings. But it's a closed-down mental health facility that used to serve around 4,000 to 5,000 patients, in and out patients. In 1995, it was closed down. And just prior to its closing, right next door, walking distance, is Gardner Correctional Institution. It's a maximum security prison. It's a very money-making facility that houses a number of inmates. And a lot of those inmates have brain health issues that aren't going to get better by containing them in prison. 2 miles just to the north of that, we have Sandy Hook Elementary School. And again, I just think this is a pictorial representation of our priorities, and I think that needs to change. Because we all become involved. As I said, the reason I got into science in the first place was being touched by Alzheimer's grandfather. We all become involved when we're touched by things personally. That's how we move through life. That's how we connect to each other. It's part of being human, to be honest. And on December 14th, when 20 children and 6 educators were murdered at Sandy Hook Elementary School, you all probably touched by this in some way indirectly on the news, or maybe you knew somebody involved with it. Now you're all very directly involved because you can get the personal experience from me. When Jennifer and I were walking around different places in the country talking to people about the foundation that we started, people often came up to us and said, I can't imagine what you're going through. I can't imagine how horrific it is. But the fact is, they are imagining it. You can't help but put yourself in somebody else's shoes and imagine it. And as horrific and horrifying that might be, it's critical that we do imagine. Because without trying to put ourselves in those shoes, without imagination, without empathizing, we won't ever change anything. It's critical that we do that. We do put ourselves in other people's shoes so that we can do something about it and change things. So we encourage people to imagine. Not just the horrible and horrific things, but the potential for hope. We want people to imagine doing something different tomorrow than we did today or yesterday. How do we react then? What do we do when we begin to imagine? With these sensationalized acts of mass violence that include Columbine, Red Lake, Oak Creek, some of these you may not have even heard of, because the list gets very long. Tucson, Aurora, Sandy Hook. Since Sandy Hook, the list goes on. The Boston Marathon, Hialeah, Florida shootings, the DC Naval Yard shootings, Sparks, Nevada stabbing. The list goes on, and it's just going to keep growing. Now, this isn't to overshadow the fact that we have violence in our urban settings, on our street corners and in our houses on a daily basis. In LA, 11.5 homicides per week. Chicago, 8. Detroit, 7. Tucson, 4. New Orleans, 3. DC, 2 per week. They just don't even make the papers. They don't make the press in a sensationalized way. So how do we react when they do make the papers? Senator Murphy, thanks for joining us. How do we react when they are on the news that we see all over, everywhere that we look, on the internet, in the newspapers, on the news? We react with typically the trifecta of guns, school safety, and mental health. As far as Jennifer and I were concerned,
excuse me,
that's an appropriate response. I think that we do need to recognize what responsible gun ownership means and how to do that safely. When it comes to safety, we have to recognize it's not school safety that we have to, not just school safety we have to recognize. We have to introspect as a community, as a culture, and look at why we aren't safe in our communities and what we're willing to do about it. Because these acts of violence don't just happen in our schools. They happen in our offices, playgrounds, street corners, marathons. They happen in all aspects of our community, and we have to recognize what we're willing to change and what we're willing to do to prevent feeling unsafe and to be safe in our communities. But when it comes to mental health, we really haven't gone far enough, if anywhere. And playing to our strengths, as I introduced earlier, being scientists, Jennifer and I wanted to focus on the brain and understanding what can go wrong that leads to acts of violence. So as a result, the need to answer why led us to developing and founding the Avielle Foundation to prevent violence through neuroscience research and community engagement and education. It's our goal to bridge biochemistry and the biochemical sciences with behavioral sciences. What is the underlying biochemical pathologies that lead to acts of violence and aggression? And doing research in a vacuum in and of itself isn't of value unless, so in other words, the von Goethe quote, knowing is not enough, we must apply. So when we make our findings, when we learn things, we feel the responsibility to teach that and to bring it to the community and educate the community and provide tools to you guys, to students, to physicians, to other educators, to parents, and to law enforcement, so that we give them the tools to use to prevent further violence and to help make our communities safer. So now as I go in and I'm going to teach you guys just a little bit about what we already do know and how we can go about understanding violence as it pertains to the brain, I want to introduce the scientist. Because a lot of people this might be new to you guys. When I say scientifically proven or scientifically established, it means something very specific. It means that something was done in an empirical, objective, and measurable fashion. Okay? That it was hypothesis-driven. You had an idea ahead of time. You didn't just look at what was out in front of you and make a conclusion. You said, I'm going to test an idea. It has to be independently reproducible. In other words, it's not just one person finding this, which is very compelling, but a number of people have had the idea and independently came to the same conclusion. That's critical, not just valuable, but that makes it scientific. It has to be powered appropriately. In other words, if you see something happen 1 or 2 times, it's not very scientific. It has to be found the same way in a large population of people or replicated a number of times so that it has a statistical value. It means something. It's not 1 or 2 times. It's every time, or so many times that you don't think it's random. And that gives it statistically sound and meaningful value. So that's what I mean when we say scientifically established. And based on scientific literature and scientifically established findings, we can come up with a paradigm of violence in which we can identify a number of risk factors that aren't necessarily causal of violence, but when you have these risk factors, you have a higher increased risk of violent and aggressive behaviors. A broken family unit, a broken or inappropriate social or peer group, when substance abuse is involved, when there's environmental stressors, perhaps you grow up in a very hostile downtown urban setting, Detroit, DC, Chicago, LA. When toxins are involved in the environment, we'll talk about all these independently. Poor nutrition can lead to violent and aggressive behavior. Physical trauma, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Exercise can prevent feelings of aggression and violence. And violent media. I'm going to cover all these and just try to briefly shed some light on what we know scientifically that establishes these as risk factors for violent and aggressive behavior. But one concept that I'm going to come back to again and again, and I want you guys to leave really understanding, is the difference between nature and nurture. Okay, nature is what you're born with, genetics. Nurture is what you develop from the environment, how you're treated, how you grow up, your experiences. All of our behaviors are comprised of equally nature and nurture. You can't separate them. Not because we're not smart enough, not because scientists haven't spent enough time trying to distinguish between them, but because they are, in fact, inseparable. Your genes determine how you interact and perceive your environment and live in the world, and the environment shapes what genes are expressed. They can't be separated. They're two sides of the same coin. So let's start with some of these aspects. I've broken them down somewhat arbitrarily, but to highlight how these risk factors are established in a scientific sense to lead to violence. Let's start with adverse childhood experiences. These are collectively called ACEs. Childhood adversity can take on all the forms of violence that we talked about: psychological, physical, sexual, or through household dysfunction, which would mean one of your parents, for example, was incarcerated, or perhaps alcoholism or drug abuse is involved. That would be household dysfunction. I think a lot of us, myself included, make some assumptions when we think about violence as a child. What happens when you grow up? And a lot of us make the assumption violence begets violence. If you were abused as a child, you're more likely to abuse your children. But is that true in a scientific sense? And it turns out that studies of abused children and the cycle of violence are very complex and oftentimes inconclusive. Specifically, the prediction of arrest for a violent crime following physical abuse leads to an odds ratio of roughly 2. Now, this is statistically significant, but how profound is that? And let's think about the meaning of this for a second. What the odds ratio means is that you're twofold more likely to be arrested for a violent crime if you were exposed to significant abuse as a child, physical abuse in this case. Twofold isn't that strong. So you can look at it in two ways. That yes, being physically abused without any interventions makes you much more likely to abuse somebody else. And that seems obvious, and I think that's the assumption that I made, and probably most of you do too. But not overwhelmingly so. So with some mild intervention, that would be easy to break. And I think that's an important concept to keep in mind for ourselves as far as and for other people, because it gives you hope. If you were abused and you were exposed to a lot of adversity, it's up to you to break that cycle, and it's in your power to break it for others. But there are a lot of negative consequences of adverse childhood experiences. Thank you, Senator Murphy. What are the consequences of adverse childhood experiences? The more adversity you experience as a child through sexual, physical, psychological, or neglectful abuse, the more social, emotional, and cognitive impairment problems you're going to have. You're going to do poorly in school. When you do poorly in school, your job potential doesn't look very good. You're going to have a lot of social problems, and you engage in risky behaviors. As a result, you don't live a healthy lifestyle. You're going to have a lot more disease and disability and social problems. that leads to early death. That's not a good thing. Another way to look at this is that if you add up the number of adverse childhood experiences that you are exposed to as a child, your odds for engaging in risky behaviors that lead to violence towards self, violence towards others, and early death go up very dramatically the more adversity you experience, from 1, 2, 3, or more than 4 adverse childhood experiences. And let's think about this practically. Very few of us are going to experience one adverse childhood experience if we're in an abusive household, for example. It's not that the abusive parent is just going to one time abuse their child. They're going to do it many times. So if you grow up in an abusive household, the chances are you've had far more than 4 experiences, which leads to huge increased risk of engaging in alcoholism, illicit drug use, IV drug use, great promiscuity sexually, and as a result, sexually transmitted diseases. And it hugely increases your propensity to hurt other people and to hurt yourself through suicide attempts. So that's the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. How about environmental stresses and toxins? What effects do they have, scientifically established, to lead to violent actions? It's well established that exposure in childhood and throughout your life to lead, polychlorinated biphenyls, methylmercury, arsenic, surprisingly profoundly, secondhand cigarette smoke, and stress itself lead to an increased propensity for violent actions, antisocial actions, decreased IQ, decreased attention span, and decreased motor development as a whole, particularly in your childhood. I think something that people take for granted, a lot of these studies that I'm citing down here are really interesting. One thing that surprised me is that exposure to these toxins isn't just in childhood that can lead to the child's deficits in these areas, but also exposure to the mom during pregnancy, so in utero. And that probably doesn't surprise a lot of people. You have to be very careful what you eat, what you're exposed to while you're pregnant. But here's a surprise for the guys out there. There's a relatively growing new field called epigenetics, which means on top of genetics. Turns out that exposure to stress, cigarette smoke, different drugs, particularly marijuana, THC, can have effects on the genetics of your offspring. So dads, you don't get off either. You all have an effect on your offspring and their development, not just when they're young, but prior to their even being born. How about nutrition? Is there any scientific evidence that that leads to violent, aggressive behaviors? I'm going to cite 2 studies. I'll try to do it quickly, but I'm a total geek, so they're very fascinating. One is that showed that severe malnutrition led to antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, violent tendencies in a very calculated fashion. It turns out during World War II, in the Netherlands, part of the Netherlands was, the entire country was Nazi occupied, but only part of it underwent very severe starvation and caloric restriction. They had less than 500 calories a day. The rest of the country was occupied but didn't undergo this caloric restriction. 18 years later, every year, 18-year-olds have to register for the military, and in doing so, they submit to a physical and psychological evaluation. And they were shocked that 18 years after this Nazi occupation, there was a huge, statistically significant increase in psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder. And they could trace it to all of those diagnosed incoming military adults. They could trace to coming from that area that was caloric restricted in the Netherlands. And everything else was age and lifestyle matched, so they could only conclude that caloric restriction, severe malnutrition, led to that psychopathic behavior 18 years later. The second study is nutritional supplements. It's the other side of the coin. They took a bunch of inmates that were violent offenders and continued to be violent in prison, And when they went to the chow line to grab their dinner, half of them were given a sugar pill, a placebo, and the other half were given a nutritional supplement of vitamins, minerals, and essential fatty acids. And they were shocked to see that they had dramatic differences, huge decrease in violent actions of the individuals on the nutritional supplements compared to the other inmates on the placebo. So this shows that nutrition matters. You can prevent violence by eating a well-balanced, nutritious diet, and you can increase violence through malnourishment. How about physical trauma, traumatic brain injury? This is getting a lot of press lately. It should. It's very important to look at. And I think when most of us think of traumatic brain injury, because of the word traumatic, we picture a skull through a pipe or a bullet to the head, or smashing your face on the windshield of your car. Very dramatic penetration of the brain. A lot of us might be familiar with the strange case of Phineas Gage, who, working on the railroad, got a tamping spike shot through his frontal lobe. This is the first scientific established study where somebody's personality was dramatically changed from one that was fairly cordial, empathetic, and funny to one that was very callous, inappropriate, crude, and promiscuous. There's differences in the reports of the change in personality, but nonetheless, it led to psychologists and psychiatrists looking at the brain and saying, I wonder if that frontal lobe is responsible for personality. We had never considered that before. And it turns out that is the region of the brain that contributes most strongly to our actual personalities themselves, to our ability to empathize, to read the faces of other people and recognize when they're upset or when they're happy, when you're in danger because somebody's angry. That's the part of the brain that's necessary to do that. What we're not usually aware of is that traumatic brain injury comes in 4 flavors, starting at the mild level, which we call a concussion, up to moderate, severe, and penetrating that we're picturing here with Phineas. And why is this important? Because even we encourage our children and our professional athletes to go out on the soccer field, to go out in the football field, and play as hard as they can. To suck it up if they get their bell rung. We laugh. You know, oh, wow, boy, you took one on the chin for that one. It's not funny because it turns out that even mild traumatic brain injury, just a concussion, leads to short and long-term changes in cognition, language, emotion, and is clearly associated with violent behaviors, violence towards others and towards self. And that the more that these go untreated, they become cumulative, worse and worse, much more dangerous over time. So we have to be aware of how to recognize when traumatic brain injury has occurred and deal with it, with having our athletes sit out, having our children not re-engaged in the same sport until they're completely healed, because it becomes traumatically damaging to their brains. And we can avoid this. It's not complicated. But what population do we need to focus on more than any of these is our military, who just in training are going to experience mild to moderate and severe concussions, damage, trauma to their brain, and certainly in combat they're going to experience this. And no other group do we say, when we say suck it up, they have to. That's their job. They have to protect themselves and their comrades while they're out there. So we have to recognize when damage has been done and get it treated and taken care of. And it could certainly account for the disproportionate increase in sexual assaults and suicides that I mentioned earlier. We need to take care of these brains. How about violent media? Before I'm trying to hurry to get to the real meat. I think, let me poll you guys. When I say violent media leads to violence, what are you guys picturing? What media? Everybody, it's the same answer I always get. Video games, of course. Turns out that video games, I have no doubt with time, we will see that violent video games, because of how immersive they are, and the experience is intended to involve the player, will have damaging effects on our brains if they're done in a violent sense. And I would just have you pause and think about how valuable it would be if we made those incredibly immersive and realistic experiences educational instead of violent. That'd be a great tool, right? We need to take advantage of that. But the science hasn't caught up yet. It doesn't show that. Not because I don't think it's true, but because we just haven't spent the time yet. But what we do know is that everywhere else, violent media leads to violent behaviors. The news, movies, TV, advertising, that is very well associated with increasing violent acts. In fact, from the 1960s till just this year, a week ago, there's been countless publications in the highest tiered scientific journals clearly establishing a link between violent media, particularly television, and acts of violence. So much so that two Surgeon Generals, Surgeon General Satcher and Koop, both issued Surgeon General warnings. These are the things you see on cigarettes. These are the things that you see on alcohol. You don't see them on television. That's a very, very powerful lobby that we have to stand against. We have to police ourselves. We have to recognize that we're empowered to let these things affect our brains or not. This is really important because it is affecting our brains, and it's pervasive. Look, just turn on the TV anytime. Ask how long it takes before you see a violent act. It will take you. You'll be shocked. Here's just one example that shows simply not even asking what the child is watching, but less than 1 hour, 1 to 3 hours, and more than 3 hours leads to a massive increase in boys or girls in aggression. If they were prior aggressors, it has a dramatically greater effect. But even kids that weren't prior aggressors have a profoundly increased acts of violence, depending on how much television they watch. All right. So let's get back to the nature and nurture of violence. I've just talked about a lot of risk factors that we have control over. These are in the nurture category, environmentally influenced. And we have to keep in mind that while many genes influence our behavior, first of all, that's pleiotropic. What I mean by pleiotropic is very simple. No one gene codes for any of our appearances. No one gene codes for your eye color or your ear shape or male pattern baldness. Not one gene encodes that. It's many genes that contribute to it, first of all. So there's not just one poison bullet that makes you good, bad, funny, not funny, serious, geeky. Many genes contribute to that. And the fact is that we aren't our genes. We're the product of all of any one gene. We're the product of all of them. And genetic predisposition is not causation, it's influence. And you can't separate, as I keep saying, the environmental effect on that. That determines how your genes manifest, but not who you are. It's important to remember that. I have a couple of examples of this. I switch them out. This is I think this is a fun one. The chair of our science advisory board, Terry Moffat, she's a real pioneer in research. She identified this enzyme called monoamine oxidase. Okay? This is an enzyme that metabolizes, it breaks down and turns off a number of the chemicals in our brain that we call neurotransmitters that transmit information. These neurotransmitters include serotonin, dopamine, adrenaline. Those are the monoamine neurotransmitters in our brain that help influence our behavior. Monoamine oxidase that breaks these neurotransmitters down comes in two forms, and I'm trying to make it simple. Sometimes I miss on my metaphors. I hope I get it on this one. It comes in the Prius version that conserves the fuel, doesn't break down these neurotransmitters a lot. It's very conservative. And it comes in the high activity version, the Hummer. It rips through that neurotransmitter fuel. Okay? And so we say, well, what do we want to be born with? Just genetically speaking, we have the low, the Prius version, or the high, the Hummer version. And we see that patients that have the low activity, or individuals with the low activity, have a decreased report of mental health problems. And these problems are typically depression. If you're ripping through the neurotransmitter fuel because you have the Hummer version, you have a significantly increased propensity for depression. Feelings of sadness. So we all go, oh, I hope the dice were rolled and I got the low activity, the Prius version. But when we take the environment into account and we say, all right, let's just look at males that were physically abused as children that had that Prius version, the low activity version. See what happened. we get a wholly different picture. Now we have a profound increase in the mental health severity score that is accounted for primarily by psychopathy. You act out potentially very violently and in a callous fashion. You have a higher risk of this. So now you would not want to have been born into a family that's abusive and had the Prius version. And it leads us to speculate, what if we took these individuals and instead of exposing them to the horrific childhood adversity that leads to psychopathic behavior, instead we nurtured them with really healthy educational families, a solid social and peer group with no environmental stresses. We protected their brains when they did their athletic events. Instead of exposing them to violent media, to educational media, they got great nutrition and lots of exercise. There wasn't any drug abuse involved. Do they become our resilient Fortune 500 leaders, our politicians? That's not a long stretch of imagination, actually, because our brains are plastic. Our brains are able to change and adapt in response to our environmental experiences. This change we call neuroplasticity occurs on a molecular level within the cells of our brain. These are called our neurons. Our neurons communicate with each other and create our thoughts and our memories through that communication. And where they touch each other at the points of communication we call synapses. And the proteins that are expressed in those synapses that make it a strong synapse or a weak synapse can be changed by environmental experiences. You can increase or decrease proteins and create different proteins in that environment depending on your experiences. It also can change on a cellular level. So we have the molecular changes, and on a cellular level, the cells can change their shape, their size, the number of projections that they put out, the number of connections and synapses with other cells can change. And contrary to what we were all taught, at least I was when I was a kid, your neurons can replicate with time. So you can make more of them. And on a regional basis, this has a dramatic effect. When we work out, when we exercise, our muscles get stronger. You increase the vasculature to the muscles so that you can take away the garbage and deliver more oxygen and nutrients to the muscles. The brain is no different. The more you use particular areas, it gets more blood flow, it gets more delivery and more facilitated, and it becomes strengthened so that it becomes more active. If you don't use an area, it atrophies, just like a muscle. And these cortical synapses, the number of connections that your cortical neurons, these brain cells, have with each other, starts out at birth, actually pretty high, 2,500 connections per cell, talking to 2,500 other cells, all talking to 2,500 other cells. That's a dramatic network. And that network increases profoundly from the ages of around 3 to 8 years old in your childhood. 15,000 connections per cell to other cells. That's amazing. And this gets pruned down into adulthood, not because we've been drinking too much or been damaging our brain, but because we've begun shaping our personalities. We've strengthened some synapses, we've eliminated others. This is called pruning. And this is what gives us our personalities and makes us who we are. And there's two things that I think we can get from this neuroplasticity effect. One is that if you're going to have an effect to foster good behavior and prevent bad behavior, clearly you want to catch it in those early years as a child. That makes clear sense. But what we also get from this is that the plastic nature, the dynamic nature of your brain to change in response to experiences occurs your entire lifetime. So you can teach an old dog new tricks, and we have to do that. But we know that this is possible. I mean, how many people do you know of whose parents quit smoking after 30 pack years? Of course you can. It's just damn hard. So again, we prefer to start preventing that behavior instead of trying to change that behavior that's been well ingrained. So the concept here is that violence is preventable. All of these things that I talked about that are risk factors scientifically proven leading to a violent and aggressive behavior, they're all things that we have control over. We can change the family unit. We can empower and teach parents how to be good parents, how to be good peers and social partners in our communities. We can develop novel interventions Some of them pharmacological, but some of them in ways that we're not thinking of right now. Transcranial electromagnetic stimulation with amphetamine exposure while you're a patient in-house. Something that we haven't thought of. You know, I mean, I'm just being wild speculative. We can come up with novel, what's that? Oh, come on. I'm being a mad scientist. Exactly, just without the hair. We can come up with mindfulness training, changed environments without toxins in them, improved nutrition. I mean, come on, school lunches, that is not helping our kids any. We can come up with exercise routines for the brain and for the body, and novel therapies, as I talked about. Because the brain is just another organ that we can look at and examine. What we need to do is link behavior and biology. I try to come up with these crazy analogies. This one misses on me sometimes, but the difference between laying on the couch in the Freudian sense, tell me about your mother, and hey, pee in this cup and let's see what you got going on, right? The biochemistry and the behavior. We've done this for a couple of things that some of you might be familiar with. This is the molecule serotonin. And for example, a lot of you know that we have the serotonin-specific reuptake inhibitors like Prozac that are antidepressants. They work because in some individuals, when you don't have enough serotonin signaling, that can lead to an increased risk of feelings of overwhelming sadness, grief, we define as depression. So we've got a bridge between the biochemistry, serotonin, and the behavior, depression. We don't know what that piece of the puzzle is that leads to violent, impulsive aggression, where the guy at the bar or in the lunch line feels suddenly offended, snaps, explodes, and beats a guy to death. And we certainly don't know the difference between reactive aggression, that's impulsive and explosive, like I was just describing, versus instrumental aggression, which is deliberate, premeditated, and proactive. This guy is ostracized from and disenfranchised from the community, and perhaps pines away, obsesses on acts of mass violence. This is your serial murderer, your rapist, the individual that goes into an elementary school and murders 26-year-olds. What's the difference between their brains and our brains? That's the scientific method. Trying to figure out, like when you watch Sesame Street, one of these kids is doing his own thing. That's the scientific method. What's the same and what's different between them? And that's what we can do, focus on for interventions. One of the problems, one of the barriers that we have right now when it comes to mental illness is that we diagnose problems of the brain symptomatically using a checklist and expert opinion. Can you imagine going into the doctor and her saying, well, your nose is running, your throat is scratchy, your eyes are a little bit watery, you're a cold. Or you got your arm broken and it's sticking out, and he says, you're a broken arm. That'd be ludicrous. But if you go into the doctor and you answer yes to 5 out of 9 questions on a checklist, your doctor defines you as depressed. And notice what she just did. She said, you're depressed. You are psychotic. You are antisocial. You are bipolar. You are callous and emotional. They're defining the individual with simple symptoms. No pathology, no actual diagnosis, just symptoms. We wouldn't stand for that if we had a broken arm. We shouldn't stand for that with the brain either. What we need to do is make the invisible visible. These things that we call mental, wow, that one is so invisible it doesn't even show up on here. What we call mental is some kind of mystical, ethereal magic thing that causes a lot of fear and trepidation. If you yourself had to go into the doctor and hear a diagnosis, or you take your child in and hear the diagnosis, oh, your child's antisocial, your child's callous and emotional, ADHD, you know, that's overwhelming. It causes a lot of fear, trepidation, the big S word, stigma. If instead you went in with your child and the doctor said, hey, little Johnny's doing great, he's right on the growth curve, good job with changing the diet and getting him to sleep a little bit more. But you're right, he does have a little bit too much dopamine in his right cingulate cortex, and that's just fancy talk that explains why his behavior is a little bit impulsive at school. So here's what we're going to do. Here's some therapy. I want you to go home, work on this for a couple weeks, come back, and we'll check it out again. Now, that's nothing to be afraid of or ashamed of. It's a matter of chemistry, not parenting style, not character, not some weakness in who you are. It's something that you can work with. You've made something visible, tangible, measurable, and real that you can then fix. This is really critical. And this is why we don't call it mental health anymore. And I really encourage you guys to go out. From now on, it'll sound weird for a couple of days, but then it'll just sound natural. Don't ever call it mental illness anymore. That's only harming us. It makes us all afraid because we don't understand it. It's a brain illness. It's in here. There's no strings attached. There's nothing magical going on. It's in your brain. It's a brain illness, and we need brain health. What we need to do is to foster and encourage basic research into the science of violence. We need to understand what are the underpinnings of aggression and violent behaviors. We've gotten a science advisory board together. We're working with them. These are real pioneers, but they're very few, trying to understand what causes violence. We haven't looked at this, and there's lots of reasons for that, and if you want, we can talk about that later, but we don't need to go in it right now. We also need to foster innovation on a genetic, biochemical, and imaging level. Technology. Right now, to get your brain imaged is extremely expensive, and these units are really rare. We need to make these biomarker assessments, whether they're fMRIs or whatever they are, something that we haven't thought of, affordable, accessible, and accurate. I talked to a professor at UCSF, Adam Gazzaley. A lot of you might have seen him on, he's on TED Talks. He's all over the place. He's helping Luminosity create their game platform. This guy's really out-of-the-box thinker, and he's come up with a lot of very creative insights on how we can make these things affordable and accurate using your iPad, using your Xbox. And you can use them in ways that we haven't thought of to look at the brain. And we need to coordinate efforts. We need to recognize that big data is going to come in. Lots of data is there already. It just needs to be analyzed. And we have to recognize that brain data is very complex, multidimensional, unstructured, noisy, incomplete, and nonlinear. I'll show you what that means in a second. But in terms of innovations, we've had a lot of innovations in very short time. We just need to apply them to understanding the brain much more specifically and what can go wrong in the brain that leads to malevolent behaviors. I'll skip this for brevity, but we've grown in just not even in my lifetime, in half my lifetime, we've gone from very rudimentary DNA analysis, restriction fragment length polymorphisms that you can use to convict a felon of a crime, or in this case, put them off inappropriately. And we can also use GWAS next generation sequencing, this is just in the last 15 years. We can look at differences in whole genomes of all of us in this room and say, oh, this is common in all tall people, and this is common in all short people, so this is a genome-associated gene with shortness. And here's the problem with a lot of the data that we have. It's in the brain, it's very complex. It's hard to understand what it means. So we need creative thinkers that can work with complexity in multi-dimensions, not just an X and a Y axis, but a lot of variables juggling at the same time. A lot of the data is unstructured. You have physician notes. What's this? There's a lot of interpretation that would take an expert to understand what a physician was writing in their notes and make it a valuable, useful piece of information. Also, the data is very noisy. It's not simple like a 3-mile y-axis. I don't know how many of you guys have worked in a lab, but results are never just black and white. They're always complicated, and you have to squint a little to see it. A lot of times they're incomplete. You don't have all the data, and they're not necessarily linear. You need some real geeky, mathematical-minded folks that can make sense of nonlinear data. So the Avielle Foundation has been founded to administrate and coordinate these efforts. And then to turn around and hopefully educate audiences like you on what can be done and what we know. We are trying to bridge research and community together. Well, we recognize we're right here, and we're going for this mountain up here to prevent violence and engender empathy in our communities. But we have to start somewhere, and we know that we'll be successful because we have imagination. And I'll be glad to take any questions if you guys are brave enough. Please.
I have a question and comment. I appreciate everything you said. I'm just back to my childhood and about violence, and I just want to speak to, especially the younger students who many of you will be parents. It is a tough job, and I just think, you know, I don't understand guns. I don't understand things like MMA. I grew up my whole life through first year college playing football. I don't understand it now, but I think that I remember Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. There was a scene there where Rhett played a game with a woman. It was really a rape scene. And I remember feeling that, and I associated that with sexual lovemaking for a while. I remember that. I remember Scarlett O'Hara and Red Butler. What's the movie? Gone with the Wind. He wants to take her upstairs, and she's like fighting and kicking. And the next scene, the sunlight's coming out, and she's all happy. I remember feeling that as a kid. I just had to force my way. I remember even when I was a really small kid, seeing Popeye. That was my favorite cartoon. He beat the crap out of Bruce or whatever. I remember feeling violent after watching that. But I'm so far from perfect. I have an 8-year-old kid. This weekend I saw Iron Man. What's the movie?
Captain America.
Yeah, Captain America 2. I loved it, and it was so violent. But I did talk to my son about, you know, in the first movie he talked about he's not a bully. He doesn't want to bully people. So there can be some positive things. It's so impossible at times to keep the kids away from it. But I think that you can do a good job. You can get rid of things. Some of our discourse with each other. We use the word hate and kill so much. And I honestly believe that makes a difference to me. It may not make a difference to anyone else if this is not scientific. But when I hear people saying, I hate this or I hate that, I think it does something to people. My dad was one of the best dads in the world, but I got spanked 5 times in my life. And it's not the pain of getting my butt slapped, but I remember the way he looked at me when he was slapping me. And it was violent. And I just don't think there's any room for that kind of violence in a home. So any of you, many of you probably grew up with that kind of violence. I'm just begging you not to recreate that in your families, and do your best to not to shield, but to educate your kid about violence as much as you can.
Thanks for the comment. That's very insightful. A couple things. One, MMA stands for mixed martial arts. Oh yes. I think what you said is really critical. It's the dialogue that you have with your 8-year-old. You have to explain the concept of suspension of disbelief. You have to explain this is a cartoon played real, or this is fantasy, and this is what makes it fantasy. And have them empathize and have them understand this is having an effect on you. It's okay to have that effect on you, and recognize that that's not okay, and that's why it's a movie. We are empowered as individuals and particularly as parents to convey the right message associated with it. I think just knowing that violent media is changing your brain, to me, that helps me to recognize, well, I don't want to act out violently. I'm not going to let it affect me that way. You are empowered to be that person. You are empowered to listen to somebody else when you completely disagree with them. The other concept I like to get across related to that indirectly, in the sense that violence is pervasive in our media. I don't think we're going to change our media, not because I'm tapping out in the MMA sense, not because I think we should give up. But do you remember when Napster was around and it was still illegal and MP3s were coming out? The music industry was just crapping their pants. They didn't know what to do about it. They were suing everybody. They were having a huge problem. Look at it today. It took somebody that said, okay, this is going to happen. It took Apple, really, to say, this is going to happen. Let's make some money on it. Let's capitalize on it. It's going to take people to say, all right, video games are out there. How do we make them educational? How do we make them healthy? Because they're not going to stop them. All of our lives, how many of us have a computer in your pocket right now? All of us probably. We're all interfaced all the time. So we can't rage against the machine. Let's just figure out how to use it healthy. Trip Hawkins, I don't know if you guys know who he is. He's the creator of EA Games, one of the largest game makers in the world. He started a company in this exact genre. He's got a new game called if you can, or if. And it's for kids, and it teaches social and emotional learning in the game. It's amazing. And again, it's an example of thinking outside the box, saying, all right, we're not going to fight it. How do we win with it? We need some more questions.
The language we use that we take for granted, that we do automatically on a day-to-day basis, how much of an influence, direct influence, would that have, or does that have, on violent behavior? I mean, acting out violent behavior. What's the trigger?
In terms of causality, there's no studies that can conclude this causes violence. There are lots of studies that correlate brain activity, particularly in centers of the brain that are your fight or flight, your communication in the brain that says, this is a threat, this is not a threat, I'm calm and cool, I'm happy, I'm not happy, I'm depressed, I'm sad. That's all in that frontal cortex where Phineas Gage had the spike. Words matter. And how they're used really matters. I can say shit and that doesn't do anything to your brain, but if I say you're a shit, it has a completely different effect on your brain. And we taught that to Avielle, that I don't care if you use bad words, so you can probably get more creative and build your vocabulary by thinking of other words. But sometimes shit is just the right word, but never against somebody. And that makes a difference. And so your words really do matter, no question about it. And that's established very scientifically. Different parts of your brain turn on depending on how you're treated. I'm not sure that it's the actual words themselves, it's just the context that they're put in. Somebody else? Please.
A child that's born with a traumatic brain injury that's during birth, my son actually, this time now, is he more prone to have violent tendencies? And if so, is there something that I can do on a preventative basis to help him? He's actually going to bullying at school right now.
He being or bullying?
He's being bullied because he's different.
Yeah. Oh, well, absolutely. You're being educated and aware that that's happening is critical. Telling him that you understand that it's happening and that that you're there to help him and to back him up. It's critical that the school works with him. But in terms of he's had brain damage, and that is going to be a barrier to a number of things. But you have to learn to break the barrier down and figure out what are different methods. And there are going to be probably lots of different ones that are offered to you, and you're going to have to trial and error them. And hopefully we are learning, in all the fields that I talked about, we're learning so much about physical trauma to the brain and how to work with it, that it's very encouraging. And I'm sure that for you, with 10 years of a child that's had TBI, that's probably not that encouraging, but you should be encouraged that they're making huge improvements. And I would encourage you just to keep working with them and encourage him to not let it break his character. And, it's really tough. And you really, I hope that the school works with you, because they need to recognize when that's going on. And if it's not, then you can change the environment, and I would really encourage it, because it's going to have an effect on you.
I facilitate a course, Crime Prevention and Personal Safety. And one of the things that we talk about is that violence is used oftentimes in the commission of a crime. But oftentimes crime can be avoided by not giving the criminal the opportunity to commit the crime. And if you recognize the factors, you oftentimes you will be able to avoid it yourself and all repercussions associated with it, as well as give the criminal the opportunity to walk away not having committed a crime. Have you seen that have you looked at that or seen that in your studies at all about criminals looking for the opportunity? And unless the opportunity is really good, because they want to be successful, they're likely to pass it up. And the only exception would be if they're desperate. If they are looking for money, for drugs or something, then they may not choose the ideal opportunity. Can you comment on that?
So you're absolutely right. I can't comment on it as a neuroscientist, but having taught self-defense courses in martial arts for most of my life, and yes, I did partake a little bit in MMA, but it's not good for your brain, and I wouldn't recommend it. Circles of awareness are really critical, and there's no question that there are victim profiles and that it's just an extension of a bully or a predator. Predators look for the weakest link in the herd, and those are the ones they take down because it takes the least energy to expenditure. You're going to victimize the weakest, or a particular profile that they think that you think is susceptible to your aggression. Knowing that, you can prevent your certainly being aware of that, and having a large circle of awareness can prevent violence from occurring. Like you pointed out, the most violent offenses are sought out independent of any emotion, predetermined. I don't think that there's anything that the kids at Sandy Hook could have done differently, or the parents or the teachers. That was the consequence of the shooter's mindset. But no question, you can profile a victim just like you can profile an aggressor. No doubt about it. You can prevent it by being aware.
I actually have a couple questions. One of them is the paradigm shift from going to a reactive society to a preventive society in terms of brain health and violence prevention. How do we measure that, like from where we are today?
There's lots of ways that we can measure it. Measuring being a reactive to a preventative society would easily be measured by saying, instead of spending 37% of our federal budget on incarceration, spending 25% on incarceration and the rest of it on research to understanding the brain and how to treat it when it goes wrong. But we don't do that. We spend a pitiful amount. The NIMH, I talked to Tom Insel, who's the head of the NIMH, and I asked why that is. Our former Health and Human Services Secretary, Catherine Sebelius, they both gave me the same answer, that they don't want to label people, they don't want people to feel subjugated, to be identified. But if you notice the way that we're taking the change in the paradigm that we're asking for isn't one of labeling. I'm not going to call somebody a psychopath. I'm not going to call somebody bipolar. I'm not labeling anybody. I'm not going to say, oh, they're on the autism spectrum here, therefore they should be placed in this program. In fact, I think the opposite. I think those are harmful diagnoses. What I'm saying is, you have high LDL cholesterol and low HDL cholesterol, you're at risk of heart disease, you should probably get on a statin and some niacin. You have too much dopamine in your right ciliary cortex, you probably have impulse control problems. That's evident by the fact that you've been arrested 3 times for beating people up. Here's what I suggest, and I think this will help you. There's no question of character there. There's no labeling. And so when I explain it to them, they say, then they come around, well, we don't fund that research right now. You have to go to National Institute of Drug Abuse, or you have to come up with some other excuse to doing that research, particularly in the United States. When it comes to particular kinds of violence, again, the Avielle Foundation is far from a second. We have nothing to do with the Second Amendment, but the fact that the CDC has been completely prevented from understanding the consequences of gun violence because of very strong lobbies against studying it. Which, why would anybody be afraid of studying what are the consequences, causes, and preventions of violence? That's been hopefully lifted. So. I'm not sure if I'm getting back to your question, but preventing violence, in terms of the paradigm shift, how can we do it and how can we measure it? One way would be the amount of money and focus we put on it, and the other is in empirical longitudinal studies saying these people underwent a program. There's some great stuff going on at the University of New Mexico and in Wisconsin in a collaboration that are taking childhood, really, really violent childhood offenders that are in juvenile detention, incarcerated, as they should be, homicide offenders, multiple homicide offenders, and putting them through very simple rehabilitation programs and having 0% recidivism. Dramatic changes. We need to foster those. We need to make them like national news. Repeat them. and then make them all national news so people understand there's hope. There's something that we can do. We're not doing anything, so it can only get better. Please.
Okay, this actually, you mentioned some of your research is in schizophrenia. Yes,
Yep, back in the day.
So what I was wondering is if you have any knowledge about toxoplasmosis and that's a parasite, and how...
My wife is so bummed she's not here right now.
Yes. And so now I'm...
And so infections and inflammation?
And how toxoplasmosis leads or is connected to schizophrenia and other brain disorders such as loss of concentration that can lead to car accidents or even suicide, which is another great topic.
So I'm going to stay off of, absolutely. I'm going to stay off of schizophrenia because I don't like labels anyway, but there's no question that infections and inflammation can cause brain disorders that have symptoms that can be diagnosed as psychoses, schizophrenia, alcoholism. There's a great book out last year or the year before called Brain on Fire. It's an example of an autoimmune disease to one of our excitatory neurotransmitter channels, the NMDA receptor. And this woman was diagnosed as an alcoholic, as a schizophrenic, as bipolar. Turned out she just had an autoimmune disorder. Inflammation in the brain and in the vasculature throughout your body can cause all kinds of disturbances, including brain health. No question about it. As far as toxoplasmosis goes, I'll defer to Jen. That's what she studied.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, please. Please in the back.
Can you talk a little more about, there's so many explosions of mental health facilities, at least people in the community, advocate more for a comprehensive mental health facilities that look at all these
Yeah.
return, or should we develop newly, or?
Yeah, I do a little bit of a disservice because I sound very critical about the fact that they were closed. A lot of them weren't doing very good jobs in and of themselves. So what's the right answer? Well, the right answer is that we need more tools to offer to these physicians and to psychologists and psychiatrists and educators, law enforcement, and parents. We're just unarmed. And there you go with the $5 in the church jar. If you pay attention to the words that you use throughout the day, you'll be shocked at how many are violent. But anyway, we don't have the tools to prevent violence or to intervene. I should say a lot of those individuals, especially the ones that were a danger to themselves or others, were put in prisons. They weren't put on the streets. And that's a catastrophe because first of all, we spend anywhere between $75,000 and $150,000 a year to incarcerate that individual that probably doesn't need to be incarcerated for a lot of them. And they're not. We don't intend them to get better. So even while they're sitting there costing us all hard-earned money, we're going to let them go someday. And there's no reason to think they'll do anything different because we didn't do anything to help them. That's not to say that there's not a lot of individuals that are pretty sick and we definitely want to have in a prison, and letting them out wouldn't be a good thing. I'm not advocating for that at all. But what I do say is that what we first need to do is understand what's going wrong and then figure out how to fix that and then open up institutions that are geared to do that. And I really like, I've worked with National Alliance of Mental Illness, NAMI. They're trying to get first aid courses, brain health first aid courses established so that they're standardized. Like you have to take a CPR and a first aid course to be a teacher. You should also have something that recognizes the signs and symptoms of some kind of brain problem, some kind of behavioral problem that seems evident, and how to respond to it in an appropriate fashion for a second grade teacher. You don't expect them to psychoanalyze somebody or figure out what therapeutic interventions they need. But to say, oh, there's a problem and something needs to be done, to recognize when bullying is occurring and say, this is having a problem, I need to step in and intervene, and this is the right way to do it. And we need to give them the tools to do that. So should we open it and reinstitutionalize? Not yet, but hopefully soon.
How do you feel though about what the healthcare system is not doing the kind of tests that needed to analyze brain health? There's a lot of resistance to, doctors ordering tests, they want to do that, and the healthcare system.
Yeah, so payers need to be incentive to pay for those kinds of tests. Socialized medicine will go a long way in that direction. The writings on the wall, it's so patently obvious that we stand to gain financially, and that's the language that they speak. They stand to gain far more by doing the appropriate tests and facilitating the appropriate interventions than they do losing the income and the patients that become violent and murderous. So that's how you incentivize payers. And physicians are all bought in, unanimously.
Where do you see some of the best research going on? Is it in the medical industry, or is it in university institutions into this area, or where do you see?
Yeah, right now it's almost entirely academic. Just this last few weeks, I've been having some amazing discussions on how we could monetize this kind of research, and not because I care to make money, but what I mean is, if there's money involved, people will get involved, and we can certainly monetize imaging and therapeutic interventions and novel therapies. And I always avoid saying drugs because I don't think that drugs are going to be the answer. It's going to be some new modality therapeutically. And that will incentivize people to put money into it. But right now, all of it is pretty much academic. And so you have your top 10, you have Harvard, Yale, MIT, Columbia, all the UC schools in California, Johns Hopkins, and Duke. That's pretty much it. Anybody else? Well, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much. I do have some stuff. I encourage you to come up and say hi, and I do have some handouts that you can give to other people. I would really encourage you to use Brain Health. Spread the word about the foundation. You guys are all on social media, so get the word out. Find us on Facebook or Twitter or our website. And take a bumper sticker and put it on your computer or your car or whatever you need.